So let's get started today with our program, Voices Through Time and Oral Odyssey. I'm going to introduce our moderator, who is Sarah Rebell. She is an arts journalist and musical theater writer. She is the 2020 National Critics Institute Fellow at the Eugene O'Neill Center as well. Prior to that, she spent 3 years contributing as a staff writer for the feminist theatrical publication, The Interval. She's also written for American Theater, The Dramatist, HowlRound, the Maestro blog, and Women in Hollywood. She is also a lyrist and book writer and has written several different works, The Awakening, Off the Wall, Rose Petals, which has had workshops and readings at Playwrights Horizon and Stages Festival of New Musicals, Finger Lakes Musical Theater Festival at NYMF. Her songs have been performed at 54 Below, Catalina Jazz Club, D Lounge, Duplex, lots of other places. She also happens to work as the communications manager at the Dramatists Guild of America. So thank you so much, Sarah, for taking time out of your workday to speak with us. I'm going to just stop my video and pass it off to you. We can take questions during this seminar. If you do have any questions, please do post them in the Q&A. The chat function is not working today. Otherwise, I will turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And thank you all to our wonderful panel for being here today, and to the audience for joining us in our panel discussion on oral histories and preserving the untold stories that allow others to gain valuable insight into your life's work. We'll be exploring oral history approaches, techniques, and best practices used by 3 theatrical organizations today: Opera America, Primary Stages, and our partners at the Dramatists Guild, the Dramatists Guild Foundation. After this conversation, we hope that all of you will be moved to consider how you might ensure that your personal narrative contributes to the rich tapestry of theatrical oral history as well. As Deborah said, I am, in addition to being the communications content manager for the Dramatists Guild, a theater journalist and oral historian. And I have actually put together an oral history project of my own, of the theater community, celebrating the life and legacy of the late actress Rebecca Luker. So I have a little bit of experience in terms of some of the processes and methodologies that go into creating an oral history, particularly for the theater community. And I'm really excited to speak with our 4 panelists today and get to hear about the projects that their institutions have worked on and what they've learned from the experiences, and share all of that with you. So to begin, let's just briefly hear a little bit about our wonderful panelists. I'm just going to go around in no particular order, and then we will start digging into the conversation with a few questions about how we define oral histories. But before we get to that, I'm thrilled to introduce Gretchen Cryer, a playwright, lyricist, performer, and director who is best known for writing and starring in I'm Getting My Act Together and Taking It on the Road with Nancy Ford. Gretchen is on the Dramatists Guild Council and is president emeritus of the Dramatists Guild Foundation, where she's worked on their oral history legacy project. Gretchen, along with her longtime writing partner Nancy Ford, recently received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Dramatists Guild this past May. Mark A. Skorka is president and CEO of Opera America. In his more than 30 years at the organization, membership has grown from 120 opera companies to 3,500 organizations and individuals. Under Mark's leadership, Opera America's Oral History Project has recorded the recollections of 75 key figures who have shaped the American opera field over the past 50 years. Casey Childs is the founder of Primary Stages in New York City, which is dedicated to producing new American plays by new American playwrights. Prior to that, he served as the artistic programs director for New Dramatists, where he oversaw the development of many new plays that went on to productions both on and off Broadway and in many regional theaters across the country and around the world. And last but not least, Sally Plass-Mackman is the director of Primary Stages' Oral History Project. She has been associated with Primary Stages for 30 years and has worked as a stage manager for many shows that Casey Childs directed, and she's also worked as a set and props designer for the company. And additionally, Sally recently completed 23 years as production stage manager for the Juilliard School of Drama third year division. So welcome all. Thank you all so much for being here today. And I would love to start our conversation by asking how you define oral history. It can kind of be perceived as a little bit of a nebulous term, and I'm not sure it's one that many people are familiar with beyond academia. So what does it mean to you in the context of your organization and your project? Yeah, why don't we start with you, Mark?
How interesting. I think of it as stories. I'm so pleased to be here with all of you, and I look forward to learning from this discussion. But I think of oral history as a collection of stories of people telling their stories and their intersection with, in our case, the opera industry, whether as administrators or as artists. And I just want people to reminisce about their journey. I try to steer it towards some lessons to be shared, some observations of then and now to give a sense of the trajectory that our industry and our art form has been on for the last 50 years. The reason we talk about 50 years is Opera America in 2020 had its 50th anniversary. So we began the Oral History Project to look at the last half century. That's why we chose that time frame. So really it is to look at trends, trajectory of the art form and of the industry, to understand the personal journey and the lessons to be gained from the personal journey of sometimes failure, sometimes triumph, and a little in between. Stories, personal stories.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And Sally, when you've been overseeing the Oral History Project at Primary Stages, that's looking at the off-Broadway theater industry. Do you also think of oral history as being comprised of stories, or from your vantage point, would you define it in a different term as well?
We have found out, we didn't quite know when we started what it was going to be, and we have discovered it becoming itself, which is an encapsulation of a world that no longer exists. So people are telling their stories, but it also has become, and Casey, please chip in on this, it has become a document of a world that this off-Broadway theater from World War II on to the present no longer exists. The freedoms that were had, the people who made it, the network that made it possible. And that more or less, for me, listening to these stories, is that network of people who have always come together and supported each other, creating this immense world of off-Broadway and off-Broadway.
Is there anything that you wanted to add to that, Casey?
Yeah, I was at a flea market the other day, and I saw somebody had thrown a book away and said how to do an oral history, and I thought I really should take that book and read it, because we made it up as we went along. Oral history is now, if you go to some college departments, it's an elective. It's something, and there are real purists in approaching oral history, that you do this, you don't do this, the person should be interviewed by somebody who does not know them, on, and don't edit, all of that. And we just sort of went on instinct. So we're flying blind here. We're interested in 4 parts. We tell the person right up front, where did you grow up and what were your early influences? The second part is, what would you consider your training or your apprenticeship years? Third part is your career. And the fourth part is, where do you see the whole off-Broadway as going? And we're interviewing a variety of artists. Yes, many of them are writers, playwrights, lyricists, composers, but we're also interviewing actors. We have a few restaurateurs in there. We have group salespeople, anybody that was deeply involved in the creation of off-Broadway and off-Broadway, and I would include the term alternative forms of theater. Inside of that, some things we're getting set to interview somebody from the world of burlesque. And from the early days of burlesque, believe it or not. So we're trying to be as inclusive as many forms of American popular entertainment as we can be, but we see it all as raw footage. We don't do any editing. We turn on the camera and the people talk. Now, if they call the next day and they said, I really shouldn't have said something, or I misspoke, or that, fine, we go in, we very inelegantly chop it out. And we're also, and I say this carefully in this post-factual world we have suddenly all found ourselves in, but we're not as concerned about facts, because many of these people have worked with thousands of different artists, and they're going to get the dates a little bit wrong, and it's going to kind of meld in their heads and stuff. Now, if they're really off, we, maybe say afterwards, maybe we should take that out or something. We're more interested in atmosphere. We're more interested in the life, in the details that you remember, and the shapes, the colors, the sounds, all of that stuff. Because now we can pretty much go on Wiki and find, the order and the correct dates and months that shows played. So that's how I define oral history. It is, many oral histories are only oral, they're audio. There's not a picture. Now it's so easy to turn on a camera, to set up a camera and to have the picture and the voice, and it's not really all that expensive. We're finding. And then we don't, as we say, we quite proudly don't do an editing process. So that's out. So it's pretty easy to do.
And you're really getting into the the methodology here, which is great. But before we get too deep into that, I also wanted to bring up, well, especially on the subject of video interviews, the legacy project at the Dramatists Guild Foundation, because the approach that you have with your project, Gretchen, is really unique, I think. And I'm curious how that came about. You have two writers on video, an older writer and a younger writer, and the younger writer is interviewing the older writer.
Right. And we were making it up as we went along too. We did not come in with a ready-made concept at all. And it sort of developed as we went along. And it's because we didn't know what we were doing to begin with. Now, Casey, I'm really interested that you said that there is out there some kind of protocol having to do with oral history. I was totally unaware of any protocol, and to right now, hearing that, that's the first time I have heard that. So I didn't know it. Again, we were just finding our own way. I think at the Dramatists Guild, before the foundation took over that project, Jonathan Reynolds had been prodding the Guild, we should be able to hear from all our esteemed writers. We need some kind of a record of them. And nobody quite knew what kind of record we were going to do, because nearly all of the esteemed writers had been interviewed from time to time by various publications. So we thought, what can we do that will be a help to other writers? The foundation started making discussions about this, and we just hit upon this idea that it would be most instructional if we focused in on the craft mainly of the writers. In other words, it's not just a generalized thing of let's hear from so-and-so. And in order to get at the craft, we came up with this idea of let's have a younger, less experienced person interview a much more experienced person, and have it be the interviewer is someone who knows the work of the older person and admires, contrary to what you suggested, Casey, of the thing of that there's sometimes been a protocol where the interviewer should know nothing about the person. Here, we wanted somebody, a younger person who knew the challenges of writing so that they could inquire of the older person about the craft of how did the more established writer, how did that person approach their craft. And so that's what started out as our concept, and it seemed to really work. Our very first interview was Lin-Manuel Miranda interviewing Joe Stein. He had always admired Joe Stein so much. And
Joe Stein, just for those who might not know, forgive me for interrupting, but one of the things he wrote was Fiddler on the Roof. He wrote the book to that. That's one of his most famous.
And that was most meaningful to Lynn because Joe had captured the zeitgeist of the people he was writing about. And Lynn does that in his own way. His tribe of people, he captures that. And Lynn had just had In the Heights on. And a strange thing happened while we were doing the interview of Joe Stein, while Lynn was talking to him. Lynn got a phone call that he'd been nominated for a Pulitzer for In the Heights. And so we were able to get him on the phone talking to the people who were telling him he had been nominated. That happened during our session. I mean, not while he was talking to Joe, but while we were taking a little break. We had the great fortune of having that happen. And that was just a very exciting thing. So that interview contains that beginning of Lynn's career. So we very carefully matched the people, and all of our interviewers were beginning to come up and get their work done, and they admired the person that they were interviewing. Adam Gettle interviewed Steve Sondheim. Now,
and you were interviewed by Georgia Stitt.
I was involved. Yes. Now, interestingly, we've done 3 volumes. Each volume contains 8 esteemed, experienced writers being interviewed by 10 different beginning writers. And when we started out, we made the conscious decision that we better interview our oldest writers first, because we had already missed so many. Arthur Miller, we'd missed so many people, and we thought we can't let that happen. And interestingly, our first volume, it was all white men being interviewed, mostly by younger white men. Wait, let me just look at the list. There may have been, no, wait. Oh, no, that is right. It was all, and one person, there was one woman involved, Kirsten Child interviewed John Kander. And so that was the rundown of the people. Then the second volume of 10 writers and 10 interviewers, women started appearing. Tina Howe was interviewed, and Mary Rogers. And the interviewers, there were 6 women interviewers. Still, let me see, was there anybody of Lynn Nottage, one person of color, interviewed Charles Fuller. So then, people of color were starting, just barely tiptoeing in. And then with our third volume, well, still mostly a lot of white people, except interviewers, Charlene Woodward, person of color.
Well, I think you're bringing up a really wonderful point, Gretchen, and that's something that I actually had wanted to ask the group, which is, as you're picking your interviewees and in some cases interviewers, are you consciously working to try to be diverse and inclusive in terms of whose stories you're capturing, and how can you go about doing that? So I would actually love to open this up and hear from everybody. We can start with you, Gretchen, certainly, but about that process.
Because we started out deciding we needed to get our oldest esteemed writers down while they were alive. They were white men. We couldn't say, okay, let's go interview a young, many of the people of color weren't even yet around yet when we started this. We must have started the Legacy Project, I don't know, 12 years or more ago. So
I think you started around 2008, based on In the
okay.
Heights.
Oh my God, so much longer ago. So again, the the landscape was quite different then. So we've wanted to, and now when we do our fourth volume, we'll have so much more to be able to be ways that we can be diverse because the landscape has changed, and this is wonderful news. I mean, just the fact that you can look and see the progress of toward diversity.
Right. What about in the opera world, Mark? How has that been a factor for you in your process?
Certainly, I think about our roster of luminaries to interview. And I'll come to your question in just one second, but just building on what's been said, I really agree that I'm in the oral histories that we've done, we are not trying to become factually surgical. It's not about that. It really is about the people and the personalities. I'm fascinated by the relationships. When we go back in time, how much smaller the industry was, and how many people grew up together through the industry, and demonstrating the importance of relationship, demonstrating the interconnectedness of our work has been, I think, a really lovely outcome. Someone should go through the oral histories and do a kind of family tree of all the relationships to find out that two great singers were roommates on Boris Goldovsky's tour of the Barboursville across the country. Who would have known that, without capturing their stories? Interestingly, I've done all of the interviews, and in contrast to the helpful hints from Casey's book, I've known virtually all of them. And perhaps that's because my career is at 45 years in the industry. So chances are I know people, but I like then making it personal to be able to say, oh, but Mark, you also, and pointing them in a direction that I might know personally that a youngster in awe of the luminary might not know or feel comfortable asking. Although I love the idea of having younger people interviewing some of the luminaries. So I have to carry that idea back. In terms of the diversity of our roster, I will say that if we reach back into the early years of the flowering of the American opera industry into the 60s, 70s, 80s, there is a wonderful diversity. I think opera went through a richness of diverse voices on stage in the 60s and 70s. I think it then diminished and it's returning today. So if I reach back, there is a wonderful collection of people who are Latino singers, of Black singers, men and women, and we are thoughtful about it too. So it is a combination of the natural occurrence in our industry and then some thought to really find some of the stories that must be told of hardship and of barriers that were overcome through extraordinary dedication and, frankly, forgiveness of people around them. One of the interesting stories that we learned, it was just, again, it came out of the discussion. I was chatting with Simon Estes, the great bass baritone who had had such success in Europe, and he finally was hired in the United States. Interestingly, he was hired by Sarah Caldwell in Boston, Artis Kranick in Chicago, Carol Fox in Chicago, and then Artis Kranick. And what was interesting was that where the racial barrier was broken were companies run by women. And the intersection here of women and their role in trailblazing around the issue of diversity, and their having overcome barriers themselves, knocking down barriers for others. So the intersection of the stories becomes really important. I regret that there are people we have missed. Doesn't anyone doing an oral history regret the people they didn't capture? But when there are important people who haven't been captured, I ask those who knew them to tell us about them. So I mentioned, for instance, Artis Kranick, just a great mentor of mine. Long gone, she passed away at the end of 1996, but I ask anyone who worked with her to tell us about her. So that way she is captured secondhand in our oral history. Again, just trying to map out who knew who and what the relationships were to create that atmosphere that to capture the atmosphere that Casey mentioned.
Yes, absolutely. And Casey, did you want to speak to this as well?
Yes, I'm not exactly sure what our demographics are, but they're pretty good. And one of the great things about doing off-Broadway and off-Broadway is that many of the people that started those companies and pursued those companies were not looking for a huge audience. That's why they went there. They were looking for smaller audiences to begin with. They were more specific, more rarefied. Broadway in the 50s, the 60s, and 70s was still pretty much an old boys network. And so I think at least 50% of our oral histories are with women, and that's just naturally happened because they had a vision. They weren't going to wait around for the system to correct itself, and they said, gee, I can see how this can be done, and I'm going to go off Broadway or off Broadway and do it. So many of the founders of these companies were women. Many of these we put together one panel of people who were just immigrants who founded companies here, and we had no trouble coming up with those, because you wouldn't find that necessarily so much on Broadway, but you find it a lot of it off Broadway and off Broadway. So we've been trying to work on ourselves to be as diverse as we can and to reach as far as we can to turn over every stone to get as many stories, diverse stories as we can.
And when we're talking about diversity, I think that goes hand in hand with the concept and notion of community, which to me at least is really at the heart of why one would choose to do an oral history in the first place, because an oral history is such a specific and rare and unique way to capture multiple voices and perspectives within a single community. And I would venture to guess that part of the reason why the book that Sally and Casey you were referring to was cautioning against being too close to the person that you're interviewing is because there is that inherent bias. And I think anybody who is undertaking this kind of oral history project can't help but have some sort of bias in terms of what they are choosing to emphasize in the questions that they ask, or the people that they're including in the project, or the way that they are ultimately presenting the project. But I'm curious how you all have, and maybe Sally, you could start for us, how you've handled the challenge of addressing that kind of unconscious bias as you're working to highlight the voices of an entire community and tell that story.
How do you define unconscious bias before I answer that?
Oh, I appreciate that question. I think that, an example of unconscious bias would just be if you are asking questions that are interesting to you, and then you realize that you without meaning to, left out asking a question about an important aspect of the industry, for example.
Casey and I, when we started, spent months figuring out the questions we were going to ask. We actually sent people questions to sort of titillate their memories more than anything. It's like 4 pages. But again, there are only 4 basic things. Where did you come from when you came to New York? What did you see? What was it like, your career, and then the future? So that leaves it open. We were very lucky in that Casey and I come from totally different places theatrically. I'm more off Broadway, and Casey comes through the O'Neill, from the Dramatists Guild, from all kinds of experiences, and we have met different people in those groups. And also, the world of off Broadway was very small. If you see Albert Poland's book on off Broadway, it was published I think around 67, 68. It was almost in a 6 blocks radius, all the theaters that were off and off Broadway. And what we try to do is hit the theaters and everybody in those theaters And then when we are interviewing somebody, if they mention people that we have not heard of, we immediately find out who those people are, get contacts for them, and we sort of spread out that way. We have the press on Harlem theaters, for instance, was very sparse. And in the last 3 years, we have developed a network of actors who have contacts with that experience from the very early theaters to theaters happening now. And that has been so exciting. But these are theaters that are not normally mentioned in the newspaper. So when you go to look up things, they're not there. So forth. And by word of mouth, we've been able to find people. Their experiences have informed us of possibilities where we must go and look. And I think we're very open to that. Casey, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I was going to add, going back a little bit. I think that the case that the people that are more purist about oral histories have, is that the oral history started as that you went in not necessarily to get information about craft or stuff, just to get the person to talk. And sometimes we have found, not always, Sally or I do the interviews mostly now. Every once in a while we have a friend of the person who's being interviewed do the interviews. Sometimes in that case, I find that the interviewee starts to speak a little bit in a shorthand because they all know the information. So it's like, you're not going to be interested in there. But if I go in as dumb as I can possibly be, you got to explain everything to me from the beginning. And that opens them up a little bit. But but ultimately you're a little bit biased going in because you're asking the questions that interest you in that moment at that time. And you try to be as open as you possibly can, and we encourage people to talk. Now, these oral histories, for us, we have no time limit. We've had people that have gone on for 7.5 hours. We've had people that have gone on for just 2 hours. We had one wonderful interview the other day. She was great, but we decided after having her on camera for, I think, 3 hours that we needed to do a part 2, and we're going to go back and see her another day. So it's very loose. We just want them to talk until they run out of things to say.
Picking up on what Sally said, I always share the questions. So we do research in advance to create the questions, and the questions follow a pattern. But that we always share the questions in advance. So that way, no one is taken by surprise. They have an opportunity to really think about their answers, particularly where they're fairly open-ended, where they really can fill in and tell the story they want to tell. I learned it from another model. I try to get started at least by asking my questions with the fewest possible words. So that way I am offering the smallest provocation I can give to get them to start talking.
Right.
That's fascinating. And I know, Gretchen, you've actually participated in the oral history project that you've set up. I'm not sure if Casey or Sally or Mark, if you have as well, but I'd love to hear a little bit about what the experience has been like to be on both sides of the camera, so to speak.
Well, Nancy Ford and I were interviewed by Georgia Stitt. We were in the 3rd volume. And it was a wonderful experience because, again, Georgia is a very talented composer herself, theater person. And so we really could have, again, our project was a bit more focused than most oral histories because it was talking about the craft, but from one craftsman talking to another craftsman about it. And so it wasn't as broadly based as the oral histories that the rest of you guys have been doing. So, but nevertheless, Georgia was very interested in how in the world we started doing what we were doing, because we had started out when we were 18 years old in college. That was when we first started collaborating. So that was just kind of interesting. And again, we were a team of 2 women. And at that point, there were no other 2 women teams in musical theater. At that point, 0. So that was kind of an interesting thing. And so it was easy. It was just an easy thing, and we did it. Georgia first went into Nancy's studio at her house and then came here to my place. And it was a very easy experience to be interviewed. But again, it was limited more. Well, though she did ask us a lot about our background, how we started doing what we were doing, just because of the uniqueness of our history of having started so young working together.
Right. And I think Sally wanted to say something. Yes.
We had the privilege of interviewing Gretchen and
Oh.
Nancy
That's right.
for our thing as well. Just for a point of reference for people who are wanting to do the oral histories, we actually do tremendous research and try to get all the work that a person has done in their career, whether they've been a founding member of a theater company, all the shows that they produced, or a performer, all the shows that they did. And we sort of build our list. This is what reminded me with Mark, thank you, of what the person has done. It's open, but we use that as a guide so that we do encompass the entire career of that person up until the point that they're being interviewed. So we go back as far as we can, and many, many different ways of doing research, whether it's online or in books and so forth and so on. And both Casey and I have seen a great deal in our lives. I started very early and off Broadway, and Casey started as a 5-year-old with his mother acting in a theater company. So we've met a lot of people, we've asked a lot of questions, but there's tremendous amount of research that all three of us do for our particular websites before we actually go in to interview the people.
And I would just like to say that when I was interviewed by Casey, oh no, I am so sorry.
No worries. We'll come back to you, Gretchen.
Okay, all right. I had turned my phone off.
Okay. Well, I would love to ask though, if for Casey and Mark, you're both artistic directors. Do you feel that the experience of interviewing so many different artists and everything you've learned from the larger picture of hearing those stories, has that informed your work in terms of how you approach what you do at your institution beyond the oral history project?
Well, I'm not an artistic director now, but I learn from everyone. I'm fascinated by everything they have to say. So I guess that's informing me in some way. It's probably informing me in the direction that I'm going to go next in terms of who we're going to pursue to interview next. But I learn from everybody, and I love it.
And I am not artistic either in terms of being president of Opera America.
Forgive me.
No, that's
Director of
okay.
an organization, I should have said. Yes.
I'm a great artist in my own mind. And but I would say that in doing all of these oral histories, it awakens a deeper sense of stewardship for me, in that there are these amazing people who have achieved things, many of them as trailblazers, some of them as just courageous artists or courageous organizational leaders. And I owe them a level of continuity that I'm capable in my small way of contributing to the flow of this industry and this art form. So it does awaken me a sense of heightened responsibility for responsible stewardship.
Well put.
Absolutely. Gretchen, I wanted to give you a chance to come back to what you were saying before. And just so everybody watching knows, it is Gretchen's birthday today, and she warned us that she might be getting some birthday greetings throughout the panel. So happy birthday to Gretchen.
Thank you. And I'm really sorry. I had my phone turned off, but it still rang through my computer.
I know.
The phone knows when you're doing a Zoom.
I know, it makes me kind of crazy. The only thing I was going to say is that I loved when they were interviewing me. That was an effortless thing too. And Casey, I have a whole file here of our interview, and I loved that because it was so general. It wasn't just about craft as much. So that was a joy to do that.
So what do you do with the content once you have these wonderful recordings and interviews? How do you decide the best way to preserve it and share it with the world? I know that many of you have been using digital archives or YouTube or your own website, but I'd love to hear a little bit about the process and the challenges of how you share the content from your project with the world. Looks like
Well,
Casey, you're ready to speak.
Yeah, we have a website, which we're going to have to rethink. I think we have to build a new website now because it's getting, in terms of websites, it's getting old after how many years it's been up for, 6, 7 years. But we put it all up on a website. The videos themselves, the interviews themselves are on YouTube server, but they access through the website. Ultimately, we don't, they're going to have to go to an organization. They're going to have to go to Lincoln Center Library or Yale or Columbia or somebody like who has a long-term a long-term program for the preservation of these materials. And that's further down the road. But right now we put them on the website and people can access them. We want the whole idea of it is that we want people to steal this information and use it freely.
We transcribe all of our interviews and make them available both in written form so people can read them as well as the video format. And I hear from people who've consumed them both ways. One of the challenges is in the transcription, so many people mention early mentors, teachers, models, and their names get garbled. And we have a wonderful editor who will spend days tracking down who was that person who was important to Mark in his elementary school. And I think he's done 100% of them. So that's of course for the written version. So that way, if we are naming names, we spell them correctly, we know who they are. So there's a written version and the video version. They're on our website, and we do release them in clusters, which we then release on our social media, which is fairly extensive in reach right now. So every so often we'll put up a cluster of them and broadly share them in our social media.
We first, this is our first volume of 10 different things. And then we were able to put it all into one, all the ones that we have into one thing, CDs. Now these are CDs, but now it's up on our website and you can actually go there and just click on all 30 of the interviews. So it started out with the old-fashioned way of CDs and now is just available online in the website.
And Deborah, if we ask the panelists to share their websites in the chat, is that something that the participants would be able to see?
I can enable that.
Because
So,
yeah, I think it would be wonderful if we could put the websites in the chat so that people can go and actually visit these websites and interact with some of the various videos and transcripts.
sure, it's open now. So if you want to type in your
Can do that.
websites, you're good to go.
Okay, fantastic. So what would you say, thinking through the process overall, and I know many of you are still in the process of doing these projects, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've encountered along the way so far? I know we've talked a little bit about, you know, who to interview and the idea of bias and what questions to choose, but are there any other challenges that you can talk about and share how you've overcome in your process with these projects?
I don't know how to define the challenges. It's just a matter of our producers are all writers. And oh no, they're not all. We have a couple of people who are board members of the Drama Skill Foundation. who are not authors themselves. But it's just a matter of we have to just get it organized again, because again, we did take a hiatus during COVID. We have not produced anymore. So our challenge will just be getting back in the saddle and doing it. But other than that, it's just a process of deciding who we should do next. And again, now we can really go for diversity. And the people that we are interviewing are getting a bit younger now because we took care of a whole generation with these 30. So it's just, for us, it's just a matter of getting back in the saddle, which we are going to do.
I find that every interview yields other ideas for interviews.
Mhm.
People mention colleagues, mention others, like, oh, there, and I always have a pencil with me. I always have a pencil. So that way I'm making note of folks who we should add to our list for oral histories. Finding new subjects has not been a problem.
What is the scope of the project? Is that something that has evolved for you, or because you initially, I thought we're doing 75?
We initially were doing 50 for our 50th anniversary.
Okay.
Uncreative that we are. And then they were so popular that we received continuing support to do another 25. And it's our intention to just keep on going. Why not capture people's stories so that they are a part, so that our community is known and available. So it's our intention to just keep on going.
Right.
Sally, did you want to speak to the challenges and how you've handled them with primary stages, or is that something that Casey would like to discuss?
For me personally, since I'm the one that tends to do the scheduling, is finding the contexts for people, because some of them have not been working for so long. It's very hard to find out, what their contact information may be. That's my primary problem as a scheduler. Casey?
I haven't found a lot of challenges that are insurmountable here. Most people usually you would think there would be legal challenges, but people seem to be more than willing to give you the release to put it on the website. There will probably be greater challenges once we turn this over to a larger institution. There will be greater challenges, I'm sure. But so far, it's all been just a matter of doing the work.
And Sally, when you talked about how it's sometimes a challenge to track down older people who maybe haven't been working in the business for quite some time, how do you usually do that? Is it just through the grapevine of asking, do you know this person? Do you know this person? Do you use social media to connect with people? How have you been able to resolve those difficulties?
It's usually word of mouth and constantly asking people, because a lot of these people do not do social media, or they're not regularly on social media. So this is, but it works. Nothing like the grapevine.
Absolutely.
We do have to coach some of our elderly colleagues in how to do a Zoom and how to line things up. And there's a little bit of technological coaching that goes on.
And Casey mentioned the release form that Primary Stages has. Mark, does Opera America have a similar kind of legal or release that people have to sign?
We do.
What does that entail exactly? Has that been challenging at all, or?
It has not been. There are only a few people who've just not wanted to be interviewed. They've wanted to keep their story more private, and we completely respect that. But we've had really no resistance to people speaking. We don't edit unless, I think as Casey explained, someone says, I really don't want to have that there, and then we'll go in. There are a few occasions where we feel that person might want to think twice about having that moment, and we'll say to that person, do you want to think about this a little bit? But for the most part, we top them and tail them, and there they are.
And Gretchen, similarly, I mean, you've actually participated in 2 out of the 3 projects that we're talking about. What was it like for you when you're being asked to sign a release, or that your story is going to be shared be it in a DVD or on YouTube or a website? How does that feel for you?
I didn't have any problem with that at all, and I signed whatever it is. Um, Sometimes pieces of the interviews have been used in other contexts. I mean, um, the Sondheim interview with Adam Gettle interviewing Sondheim has been used in a lot of different contexts, even at Sondheim's one of his memorials and so forth. So it. But for me, I'm okay with it being used however anybody would want to use it. So I didn't have any reservations at all about it.
One of the reasons why we are having this panel, this conversation about oral history in the context of a week on estate planning and legacy is because we think of oral history as a way in which you can preserve your legacy. And I think you're speaking to that, Gretchen, when you're talking about how excerpts from an interview of Sondheim were then played at one of his memorials. And I'm curious if you all might want to speak to the relationship between oral history and legacy, particularly in regard to the theater community and the opera community.
I feel that it's so lucky that we started our project 15 years ago, again, because we have captured many people who died shortly after we did, but we got them while they were in full, robust health, pretty much, and had a long legacy behind them. Um, and uh, and I'm so grateful. I mean, I was just looking at the names, and so many of the people who were in our first volume have passed away. And so I'm just glad, and I'm so sorry that we missed August Wilson. We missed Comden Green. We missed so many people, Lillian Hellman. We missed Arthur Miller. And we didn't start this until then, because you can look at them and, oh my God, there they are. They're not with us anymore, but we hear them talking. There's something so rich about that. And it's just wonderful. It's inspiring. Then we do make these things available initially to theaters around the country and university theater departments as well. So kids in school can look and actually see Stephen Sondheim sitting at his piano and playing a little thing, and that's just very inspiring on a soul level, I think.
What about for primary stages? You have a really interesting opportunity with your project, because I would think you are capturing the legacies, as you mentioned, of companies and artists and writers who might otherwise have maybe fallen out of the collective living memory of history. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and the idea that an individual who maybe didn't think that their story would want to be remembered, it actually has incredible value, especially in the context of this larger tapestry.
Well, we're in a business that is so ephemeral, that at the end of a production, at the end of a play, what do you have? I mean, at least the writers have it written down, and we have a few pictures. And if you're lucky enough, somebody did a video of it or some clips or something. But other than that, all we have are the stories. And you have this very tight family, and then that family breaks up and goes some other place. For many people, I like to think that this is very important to them, that nobody showed any interest in their story before. Nobody showed any interest in what they were doing and what they were doing 30, 40 years ago. And so they take it very seriously, which is great. We too have had, I think, over 40 of our participants have passed away. Now we're regularly referred to in the obits. I go to memorial services and I see clips from our oral history at memorial services, and I'm quite flattered. Speaking of which, if we were to do something more, with the stuff that we have shot, let's say that we did a PBS 60-minute or 90-minute something, or we would go back to the artist, we'd certainly go back to the estates and say, is it okay if we're going to use it? Because even though that's kind of covered in the letter, it's not, we'd still want to say, we're making a film of this. But we can't guarantee that other groups aren't going to just take it off of YouTube. A lot of broadcasters are good about that. We've heard from the BBC that they want to use this clip or that clip. We say, sure, fine, take it.
Mark, did you want to speak to the question of oral history and legacy, and particularly in regard to the opera community?
No, I'm fascinated listening to my colleagues on this Zoom about the real depth of their capture. Hours are generally not more than an hour. Sometimes they go a little bit longer than that. And they are kind of, my dinner with Andre, sort of catching up and just getting to know them. I don't think it captures legacy. I think it is like a snapshot. You went away for a weekend and you took pictures with friends. And I think it is a series of pictures with friends rather than a real legacy. And this whole hour, I've been thinking to myself, what about, the deeper dive? And is it our role to do that deeper dive, or in fact to allow others to do a deeper dive and we just do a family album, as it were?
Well, I would argue that a family album ultimately becomes a legacy as well, but fair enough.
I appreciate that. You make me feel better. Thank you for that.
Of course, I know we're going to have a hard out soon, and so we have to start to wrap up. The final question that I would like to ask of our wonderful panel today is thinking about the audience that we have here. It's a lot of writers who maybe want to be part of an oral history project. Maybe they want to figure out a way to preserve their legacy and their impact or experience with the theater and opera communities, and their thoughts about their work and the productions that they've had and their collaborators. What would you advise them if they want to participate, for instance, in the Primary Stages project or the Opera America project? Is there a way to do it? Would you recommend that they start their own project instead? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I would hope that if there's anyone who really wants to tell a story that contributes to our sense of the atmosphere, a sense of the progress of the industry in the field, just let us know. That can be an email to me, email to our project coordinator, Vincent Rudder-Cavato. We would welcome that, and they may have in mind something that is bigger, deeper than ours, but if they wish to start with us, I would hope that they would be in touch.
Wonderful. And for Primary Stages as well, is that the case, Sally and Casey?
Sally, I think you're on mute.
Go ahead, then. Yes, I think that they could contact us without any problems. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. And all of this information should be available through the organization's websites, but if you have any difficulty, you're definitely welcome to contact the Dramatists Guild and DGCM, and we will connect you as well.